Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This will be the continuation of Splintering Ice. This will be Part 2, Chapter 2, entitled Frozen. Every now and again, Shota finds himself thinking back on his class's training camp incident. It seems distant now, more than 2/3 of the way done with the year. They've faced other challenges since then. So has he. Yet at the weirdest of times, he gets taken back to when he was charging through the forest, dragging his students back to the waiting ambulances, directing those who could walk to help those who couldn't. The students of Class 1B falling into line under Shota's direction, without even hesitating because their fear of the situation was just that great. Finally running into the clearing that Bakugo had been taken from them in, hearing the blood-curdling scream of one problem child, head bowed and arms bound in makeshift bandages. The images flash into his mind 1 second and are gone the next. Not even a flinch or a blink to suggest he had even been reminded of such times. It's irrational, he knows. And that fact alone is enough to drive him nuts. He knows that incident doesn't matter anymore. He knows that his students are strong and resilient, and while they might think back on that time too, they probably see it as a motivator more than anything. Something to push them closer to success. Shota only sees the incident as a wholehearted failure on his part. The helplessness he felt, not knowing where his students were, running through the trees, finding Midoriya, and really feeling the gravity of the situation shift into place upon noticing his condition. Informing his students, despite the rules put into place, to fight for their lives, because he knew he couldn't save them all by himself. That helplessness, the bitter kind that coils in your chest and continues to push the air from your lungs, feels sort of like the type he feels now, actually. Charging through drifts of snow that go up to his knees, breath puffing in front of him as he practically shouts into his phone. "I'm on my way to their location too, Shota." Hisashi's voice is strained. He's obviously running towards the commotion, but it only serves to send Shota's nerves further on edge because at least Hisashi is close to his students. Aizawa's on the opposite side of the fucking mountain. They'll be fine. They're capable of holding out until we get there, and they've got each other. Shota grunts breathlessly, nearly tripping on a block of ice before continuing. It seemed that every time they left campus, something like this had to happen. USJ, training camp, their internships and work studies. If it was up to Shota, they wouldn't have taken this damn trip in the first place. USJ, while having been the home to one of their joyous outing adventures, is at least equipped with safety precautions. But this was a getaway, a chance to test the students' rescue abilities in the field, and not a simulation of sorts. It had actually been Asui's idea, strangely enough. She had said something about wanting to work at getting rid of her weakness to the cold. Midoriya chimed in about the training facility on Mount Hotaka. 3 fortified buildings surrounding the fenced-in area of the facility. The area was built for this exact thing, although not usually for UA. Other, closer hero schools. He had immediately wanted to shoot it down, but the rest of the class had readily agreed to check it out, and Shota found himself weak under their excitement, all things considered. So, when he spoke to Nezu, he got the permission slips ready, and the security prepared for the trip, and 2 other teachers, Present Mike and All Might. A pair he definitely hadn't been looking forward to being stuck in a freezing, isolated facility with for the better part of a week. Now he couldn't be more grateful they had come, even if one isn't powered any longer. Just as the thought crosses his mind, a weaponized scream through the speaker by his ear startles him enough to almost drop his phone. The line cuts out right after, and Shota feels dread at no longer being in contact with Hisashi, and yet also feels infinitely grateful that he made it to his students. He continues through the trees, snow billowing in front of him, and the few trees around him swaying back and forth. It's perfect for cold weather rescue training, and it had been going perfectly too, until he got an alert ping on his phone about a perimeter breach and several dozen messages from students, security members, and his fellow teachers alike. He only was able to read a handful of them. Ashido's texts were practically illegible, probably typed in an uncaring hurry while they were being attacked, something about their location being near the building Present Mike was in. Ida's were much easier to decipher, an error here and there which, due to the perfectionist nature of the student, made it abundantly clear that the situation was more serious than Shota had hoped. His message had detailed the attacker's appearance somewhat, as well as who Ida had been with at the time of the attack: Ashido, Bakugo, Shoji Midoriya, and Hagakure. He had read one from a security guard detailing the area of the breach, as well as explaining that they had contacted authorities just in case and were investigating. All useless information considering there was no need to investigate. There was only a need to act. He had gotten the message from All Might just before Hisashi had called him. The man was holed up in his own building closer to the base of the mountain. Each of them were stationed at one of the 3 buildings alone. Camera monitors available in each to keep an eye on their students for grading purposes. The breach had been near his building, and Shota was thankful the breacher hadn't thought to attack there. All Might was incapable of helping at all in this situation, much less defend himself against someone who was able to break through the facility's shields should they choose to act violently. All Might's message had explained his theory on the quirk of the breacher. Since the shields around the facility were not only strengthened by one of the facility's original security personnel's quirks, being a force field of sorts, allowing weather to flow through, but nothing much else, there was also electric fences set up alongside them. High voltage, enough to kill practically anyone, strong quirk or not, and from the footage All Might's building cameras picked up when the breacher passed, the man was very clearly alive, completely unharmed, according to him. So, the only real answer would be that the breacher had a shield quirk of some sort, to protect himself against the electrical currents and the force field alike, as per All Might's theory, and yet something else felt fishy here, considering the force field was meant to be impenetrable. Shota! Shota pushed the thought aside as soon as he heard the familiar voice ahead of him. It was carried to him by the wind, but only a moment more of trudging through the snow did he finally catch sight of Izashi's golden hair through the snowfall. He looked tousled, snow catching on the back of his hero costume, and his hair lacking its stiffness, pieces falling loose and blowing in the wind. He seemed to be favoring his right leg. Concern began blooming in Shota's chest. Mike. Listen, man. Hisashi starts, breath huffing harshly and misting into the air between them. I messed up my knee pretty badly. I'm going to lead these kids back to the closest base, but you need to go after that guy ASAP. Shota glances behind Hisashi, taking note of his students and their conditions. Similar to Hisashi, they seemed worse for wear, but nothing too drastic. Their hair messy and a bruise here or there. Hagakuri's form was easier to see due to the snow accumulating on her, and Shota took note of how Ida's exhaust pipes were steaming, the heat of his quirk making contact with the cold of the air around them. Bakugo was kneeled on the ground, a thin stream of blood falling into his eyes from a wound in his hairline. Probably a concussion. Asui, likewise, was huddled close to Shoji, the latter using his arms to shield her from the torrential wind and snow. Whatever the reason of Hisashi wanting Shota to follow the villain so desperately, it was very obvious that he was spot on with the need to get their students back to base. Shota cursed himself, looking back to Hisashi. Do you know where he was headed? What he wanted? His quirk? Hisashi shook his head, stepping back and snacking Bakugo's arm, lifting him to his feet. No, I was just focused on getting him away from the little listeners, but none of their or my attack seemed to have done any damage. Bakugo sways on his feet, glaring at a particular spot past Aizawa's shoulder, clearly lost in thought. That pit of concern in Shota's chest deepens ever so slightly. That doesn't matter, though. You need to go help Midoriya, Shota. Shota can feel his expression twist into one of anger. Midoriya went after him alone. Hisashi starts, but is quickly cut off by the load he was helping stay on his feet. The fucking nerd lured him away, Bakugo snarls. Just fucking took off without us like an idiot. He saved me from getting hit by the villain when my engine stalled, Sensei, Ida chimes in, scuffing the ground with his foot. That apparently angered him, and Midoriya was able to lure him away from us before we even knew what was going on. Shota's teeth clench, hands turning to fists at his side. Which direction? Hisashi drags Bakugo to the side, motioning towards a clear path of footprints, leading further into the wooded area of the mountain. Shota immediately takes off in that direction, calling out to Hisashi one last time. Contact the security detail and send them in our direction, and try to contact the authorities while you're at it. I'll call you when we're safe. He doesn't hear any responses before the whistling wind becomes the only sound Shota can hear once again. He clomps through the snow, thanking whatever deity that he had chosen to wear extra layers. He hadn't planned on actually being out in the weather, necessarily. Precisely the reason why he, All Might, and Hisashi were each placed in an observation base. The snow was already soaking through his boots and pants, and he felt a raw numbness take over the skin in that area. All of that wasn't the prime area of focus for him, however. The tracks in front of him just kept going on, and Shota was left wondering if he'd reached a point where they ended entirely, but left him empty-handed just the same. Midoriya was going to leave him with an entire head of gray hairs by the time the year was over. The kid had no self-restraint or self-preservation at all, it seems. He'd been working on it. Since their mission to rescue Eri, the kid had managed to stay out of harm's way for the most part. No more broken bones since before then either. Shota had been pleased. Beyond words, honestly. More than he could ever hope to express. He felt he could finally let his guard down about Midoriya doing anything, knowing that the kid at least understood that you can't just snap your bones every time you get into a semi-difficult situation. He knows that the training camp incident was a completely different circumstance. He doesn't know what the battle Midoriya was a part of was like, but he had seen the opponent he was up against, knew what the villain's quirk was after the official report was given to UA for inspection for legal purposes. He had seen the kid in the hospital bed, knowing that only one of his broken arms was actually his fault from what the nurses had said in passing. Everything else was damage he'd taken from attacks. Self-defense, Shota knew, and arguably more important for someone training to be a hero, defense of someone else. Midoriya just definitely needed to consider his priorities between the two types of defense more closely, as well as what those types of defense can include other than fighting back. But then this stunt. It doesn't matter if it was an opportunity he was given, since the villain apparently had his sights locked on Midoriya near the end of the scuffle. And it doesn't matter if Midoriya had his reasons for making the choice he did. Hisashi wasn't a pushover. The two of them had been in plenty of tight fights together, and Hisashi was capable, even against a villain apparently as tough as this guy. He could have held out until Shota got there. He would place his bet on that fact any day. But then Midoriya hadn't taken that into consideration, obviously. He had been concerned about Ida, saving him entirely from an attack by the villain. He had probably been concerned about Bakugo's obvious concussion and Asui's cold temperature endurance, and how much longer Shoji and Hagekure would be able to hold up with two members of their group already weakened. Hell, the kid probably felt concern for Mike too, especially once Hisashi's attacks apparently failed and he got knocked around a bit. Shota was willing to place his money on that Midoriya hadn't once considered how he was going to get out of the situation. Well, he was probably doing that now, being alone with a child-hunting maniac in the middle of a snowstorm on a mountain. They were headed down the mountain. It was obvious when Shota considered the small observations he'd picked up since leaving his base. The wind direction was blowing towards him now, whereas running east towards where he had been told the attack was at, it had been blowing at his right side. They were headed south, towards the base of the mountain, back towards where All Might had spotted the villain on the security cameras. That could work in their favor if there were security personnel already there investigating the incident. Something shakes beneath his feet, a rumbling like an earthquake that only lasts 2 seconds tops. An impact. Midoriya. Damn it! If at all possible, Shota pushes himself to run even faster. The conditions don't work in his favor in the slightest. He can barely manage to keep his eyes open as the wind billows against him. Not good, but he manages it. Slowly, as he continues to follow the trail, he begins hearing the sounds of battle. Shouts, angry screams, too deep to be from Midoriya. Crashes, sounding like trees being uprooted and shattered. "Stop struggling, brat!" A loud shout, followed by another crash, follows the order. And then suddenly a green light is flying by Shota, crashing through a tree to his right and rolling in the snow for several feet. Shota resists the urge to go to his student's side, instead whipping to the left towards where the villain no doubt was. There, standing in a hulking form above Shota, is the villain that All Might had described to him. The villain reels his arm back, and Shota engages his erasure before the guy has an opportunity to use his quirk. Shota lunges backward, avoiding the punch toward him, before flinging his capture scarf out and wrapping it around the villain's torso. All Might predicted that the quirk was a shield of some sort, or healing. Either way, restraining him and keeping erasure locked on him would take care of that easily. Except, the wind was already making it difficult to see clearly when he was running here. To keep his eyes open long enough for them to get the villain down to the authorities would be impossible, even without his attention being split between his opponent and his student several feet behind him. He blinks. Then he's flying through the air, hitting the cold crowd roughly. The air pushed from his chest as he attempts to gather his senses. What had happened? The guy hadn't moved. That meant it was his quirk, but what was it? Telekinesis, something like Bakugo's explosions. Shota gasps, only barely realizing that there are red sneakers directly in front of him, 2 hands clasping his shirt and dragging him through the snow. There's another impact by Shota's feet as the hulking form barrels towards them and ultimately misses. "Mr. Aizawa." Shota, despite his spasming diaphragm, manages to grunt, pushing himself up to a kneeling position beside his student. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay?" Sorry? Shota feels the need to question Midoriya's meaning, but chooses to instead pull Midoriya to him, sprinting away from the villain as quickly as he could manage while dragging Midoriya behind him by the wrist. "The villain!" Midoriya shouts over the whistling of the wind. "I think he's got a type of regeneration quirk, Sensei." Shota takes a sharp turn when he notices another sound of an impact directly behind them. He ducks beneath some branches, trying his best to not force Midoriya into the tree and other obstacles. How? He absorbs damage, like Fat Gum's quirk, and heals when he shoots the damage back at his opponent. Midoriya shouts, yanking his hand from Shota's grasp to more easily keep up with his teacher. All that damage he's giving out is from the damage I caused him earlier. Right. Midoriya loves studying quirks. Shota has seen him scribbling away at his notebooks numerous times, and has only gotten a vague idea of the type of analysis he does in them. And the kid has successfully identified plenty of less identifiable heroes in the past, including Shota himself. Taking that into account, if the kid is right, then the impact Shota had felt, that had been the pain that Midoriya had caused this villain. It had felt like his ribcage was on the verge of shattering. But that left the question of how he had gotten through the force field. He couldn't heal himself immediately, as he was going through, since he relies on giving that pain and injuries to other people. That meant there very well could be someone or multiple people already dead at the barrier. Shit. Listen, Midoriya, Shota shouts, glancing around them, noting their new environment as they slide to a stop in the snow. Groves of skeletal trees surround them, and the small frozen lake a few hundred feet from them, barely identifiable under the thick snow as a lake. I can't use a razor as long as usual because of the wind making me blink. As soon as you see my hair go up, lay into this guy, all right? Go for the head. It was the only way to make this fight as short and as clean as possible. Knocking the villain unconscious would ensure that he couldn't use Midoriya's extremely strong quirk against them. He figured that Midoriya had already experienced his own strength used against him, judging by the way he was slightly hunched over. Shota could still feel the zing in his abdomen from the impact. They wouldn't be able to take many more of those. Midoriya, for his part, gives a strong nod, green lightning shooting off of him, and his stance widening in preparation. Shota can hear the villain coming closer, the snapping of twigs and the crunch of snow. Heavy breathing. He steels himself, bringing his goggles up to protect his eyes from damage, even if they don't succeed in keeping the wind away. The villain bursts through the tree line, and Shota immediately activates his quirk. The villain doesn't stop charging for them, but Midoriya does, as he was told anyway. He bolts away, shooting through the air and swinging his legs at the villain's head. The sound of the impact could make even the most stoic of individuals cringe. There's a loud crunch as the man's nose breaks, and he dead falls to the ground. Midoriya lands a few feet in front of him, stumbling slightly as his feet catch awkwardly in the snow. He shoots back to stand beside Shota, staring at the villain's fallen form as if he'll rise and continue the assault. But he doesn't. Shota sighs, releasing erasure and reaching underneath his goggles to massage his dried eyes. He can see Midoriya slump beside him in relief, green hair thrashing back and forth as the wind continues to blow viciously around them. Red stains his cheeks from wind burn and the cold in general. He has a few rips in the back of his costume, probably from when he got thrown through that tree earlier. No apparent wounds, though, much to Shota's relief. All right, I'm going to contact the security detail to get this villain apprehended as soon as possible. Then we need to contact President Mike and All Might to update them on the situation. Shota pauses, noting how Midoriya was doing his damnedest of covering up the tremors running through his frame. His fists were clenched, jaw jerking every few seconds as his teeth threatened to chatter. Shota suddenly finds it more difficult to ignore the numbing burn of his calves and feet. Then we'll get warmed up at the base. Midoriya nods, clearly looking forward to the warmth Shota had just promised. Shota's mouth quirks up ever so slightly. The kid wasn't even aware of the lecture he was going to get later. Or maybe he was. And he just was so used to it by now that he couldn't effectively show his contempt for the future event. Are the others okay? Shota is dialing up the security detail he had mentioned earlier when Midoriya asks. They're close to the barrier, all things considered, meaning that the security personnel would probably only take 10 minutes or so at most to reach their location. Shota presses the call button, looking down to Midoriya. Yes, they're all right. President Mike is with them, and they're probably already being tended to by him and your classmates, if not the on-site medics. Though the medics were likely with security personnel along the border of the training area, if it was true that the villain used his quirk against somebody already. The likelihood of them having reached President Mike's outpost was slim. He wouldn't tell Midoriya that, though. Midoriya smiles as the ringing in Shota's phone starts. Good. That's good. I was worried. Shota is about to respond when his vision is completely blacked out, cold crashing into his face and stinging his eyes. He stumbles back a pace and immediately takes action before he completely figures out what is happening. It happens a little too fast, actually. By the time Shota realizes that he's just had snow thrown tactfully into his eyes, he's already snagged Midoriya's arm and yanking him out of the way of the onslaught to come. His other hand reaches for his knife at the back of his belt, binding cloth already unraveling simultaneously. He can't see where the villain is, yet he knows that there's an attack coming that he can't stop with his vision completely out of order. He slashes out, feeling the knife embed itself in flesh right as the capture weapon wraps around what Shota assumes to be the villain's torso. But then it's too late, though. Shota knows this as he is then blasted backwards, a crack echoing inside his head as his own nose is broken. His capture weapon rips as he's thrown backwards, his grasp on Midoriya releasing immediately, and the little bit of vision he has blackens around the edges. He lands with a loud grunt, hands immediately grasping for his face on instinct as his body acts out the need to get Midoriya and get away. He hears Midoriya in the distance. Distance? How far does this damn quirk throw people on impact? Cursing at the villain, and Shota has the sudden fear that the kid is actually trying to fight their opponent head-on again. But the next thing he knows, there's hands grappling with his shoulders, trying to force him into a sitting position while mumbling what Shota hears as continuous, "Sorry, sorry, 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 sorry." Shota prioritizes getting the snow out of his eyes as Midoriya gets him into a standing position, however slumped onto the younger individual it is. He manages to clear his vision enough to see the next attack coming, without the means to actually stop it, or even attempt to this time. And Midoriya, with this quirk based off of direct contact more than anything else, doesn't have any more luck than Shota. He could have predicted what came next just the same, though. The hands that were holding him up just a moment ago shove him roughly away, and Shota's forced to watch as the villain, Shota's knife previously embedded in his shoulder, forces the very same injury onto Midoriya. Shota shouts out as Midoriya goes flying backwards, landing roughly and rolling in the now red-tinted snow. The villain ignores Shota, marching towards Midoriya, and Shota finds a second wind at the prospect of this villain attacking a still recovering Midoriya as he lays in bloodied snow. The image itself has Shota flinging out his binding cloth as the villain gets mere feet from Midoriya, wrapping around his limbs and torso. Shota forces his eyes to remain open, ensuring Midoriya's safety for at least a moment. A loud crack fills the air around them. Not like the trees that were being ripped through earlier, and not like when the villain's and ultimately Shota's own nose was broken. This is a deep sound, one that rumbles in Shota's chest, and it takes him a moment to realize that this crack is the sound of ice buckling under weight. His blood freezes in his veins, eyes growing wider as he realizes that the distance between him and Midoriya being thrown backwards by the villain's quirk was enough to place his student at the center of the frozen lake. When Shota catches Midoriya's gaze, he can tell that his student understands this as well. Shota shouts despite this, "Get out of there!" Midoriya stands, red coating the right side of his torso, and Shota is already dismissing the villain in favor of trying to wrap the cloth around Midoriya to drag him to safety. He winds it back, but before he gets the opportunity to shoot it towards his student, the villain lunges. The ice splinters below them, deep cracks webbing around Midoriya's feet as the boy charges up his quirk to escape. He doesn't get the chance to. Midoriya's green and wide eyes glance towards Shota. Shota shoots out his capture weapon desperately. The ice buckles completely. The villain and Midoriya sink below the water. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 2 of Splintering Ice. Let me know your all's thoughts and reactions so far. Chapter 3 will be next, and as always, thank you so much for listening.